All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 4, which is a big chapter in this book, which talks about JavaScript objects. And we're going to see, learn a lot about JavaScript objects, as well as writing functions and some different events. And so there's a lot of heavy material in here, and so kind of jumping right in, there's a lot of what you would call built-in objects or native objects, and so we're going to take a look at some of these built-in objects and what are called host objects, and so they're different things there. Anyways, they're all objects built into JavaScript, right? And then there's custom objects that we can build as well as what is an object, and kind of, I'm just throwing this term out here like, oh yeah, objects, like what that is. And so we're going to break down this term object and really what is an object, and then start taking a look at the built-in ones in JavaScript. And then once we start breaking down objects, we're going to see a lot of these different methods that are out there, like parseInt and query selector and focus and select, and basically all of these things that you can do, because that's what a method is. It's a block of code that does something. So once you learn about an object, and then you can learn about that object's methods, we're going to start breaking down those methods. And so you can kind of see here all these methods. I could tell they're methods because they're they've got parentheses at the end of them, and so these are basically all a bunch of methods that belong to objects. And then we're going to learn how to write functions, and that's not an easy task in JavaScript. It's actually what makes it kind of complex is that there's so many ways of writing functions, and I'm using the term method versus function, and there is a small distinction between the two. But yeah, so the second half of this lecture is really going to be focused on writing our own custom functions. And then all the different ways that you can do that. Talk about not only these things called function expressions, but there's also something called a function declaration, function expression, and arrow functions. Because again, it's not like when I first learned how to write my own custom function, it was like one way of doing it, and and it was nice and simple, and it's a little bit more complex in JavaScript. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about scoping of variables and this concept of global scope, local, and block. And then this event called DOM content loaded, and kind of what's the benefits of that. That's easy to cover. And then how to stop some default events from happening using this prevent default method. Again, a lot of built-in objects like the event object and their methods. So we got to learn what is an object, what are the types of objects, and what are all their methods. That just goes along with that. So again, I kind of always just like to code as I do these demonstrations, and a lot of what I say I just kind of keep in my notes. And so why is this important? JavaScript is known as a I'll pull this up. This Wikipedia says a lot that's worth kind of reading through a couple of times about what JavaScript is. And so this first paragraph, I think, is something that we all know at this point, and we've covered the basics of JavaScript, which is covered in this first paragraph. The second paragraph we'll start here. JavaScript is a high level. high level versus low level programming. High level means it's abstract and it's not very it's not low level, which low level is basically you're coding with binary. And if you're coding with binary, that literally in the early days of coding, you had to tell a computer or a processor how to add 2 plus 2, by giving it binary bits, ones and zeros. And you literally, with punch cards, that would punch holes in these cards to represent binary bits, ones and zeros. A hole punch would represent a 1 and no hole punch would represent a 0, something like that. I've never done it. I've read about it in books. And then you would feed the computers with these punch cards, and that was considered low-level programming. Of course, no one wants to program with binary because to do anything, there's a lot of binary bits. And so they make high-level languages that use words instead. And those words get translated into binary bits to tell the processor what to do. So JavaScript high level, just in time compiled. A lot of languages are compiled before, like you will write code and you will compile code, and if the code doesn't compile, it will never run. JavaScript is just in time compiled, meaning we don't have to compile it. The JavaScript engine will handle that for us. That's built into the browser, so we don't have to compile before we run. ECMAScript, we talked about, that's a synonym for JavaScript, like basically new versions of JavaScript. When they say new versions of ECMAScript, that's like a new version of JavaScript. Okay. It has dynamic typing, which means we can store our variables in let data types. Our data types are kind of handled for us, again, by the JavaScript engine. We don't have to say this is a string. We just say let username equals, and then because it's in quotes, the engine figures out that that is a string or a number or whatever the data is. It figures out the data typing for us. Prototype-based, object-oriented. Okay, all that to say that JavaScript is object-oriented programming. So if you've studied C#, if you've studied Java, okay, those are classic object-oriented programming languages, and you have now an understanding that there are objects in JavaScript. Prototype-based means basically there's a bunch of built-in classes that are your prototypes that you can create those kinds of objects. Okay, and we're gonna dive into first-class functions in the second half of this. Okay, I'm saying a whole lot right here. JavaScript is a multi-paradigm language, which means, so object-oriented is a paradigm. It says we are going to code in this system called object-oriented. There is another paradigm called functional programming. You can kind of see when I hover, functional programming is a paradigm where programs are constructed by applying and composing functions. So no classes and objects, just a bunch of functions. It is a declarative programming paradigm in which function definitions are trees of expressions. Okay, so that is another paradigm. So we've got object-oriented paradigm, we've got functional paradigm, and we've got this other one called imperative. And so what am I getting to here? Well, ultimately I wanted to show that there are objects because it is object-oriented. JavaScript is object-oriented, but it's also functional and it's also imperative, which means you can write JavaScript in all sorts of various different ways. And not only various ways, but they just kind of pull in different it pulls in different aspects of different paradigms. And so JavaScript uses different aspects of different paradigms, which makes it challenging to learn because, okay, maybe you've studied object-oriented, but you've never studied functional programming. And so when you see something in JavaScript, it's like, well, that wouldn't seem to make sense because, I didn't study this other style. Now, I will tell you, imperative programming, if you kind of imperative programming, as we get into React, and we will get into React, we will code in an imperative style. So in our curriculum here, we will study C# and we will do object-oriented programming. We will do some imperative programming. Currently, we don't do a whole lot of functional programming. Okay, all that just to say, that kind of like this piece right here, prototype-based, object-oriented programming. So there are objects in JavaScript. And what is an object? Well, an object is how we store a thing in software. And if that sounds super generic, obviously it's because it is. You could take anything in the real world, and if you want to represent it in code, you could make it an object. So I'm sitting in a chair. A chair is an object. A chair is a thing. If you want to say all the nouns can be objects, all the people, places, and things. You represent that thing in software, and that is an object. So I pulled up that Wikipedia to show you that, again, maybe I'm repeating myself here, but JavaScript has objects because it's object-oriented. It is also functional. It is also imperative. That's why it's multi-paradigm. But we're now just breaking down the objects. So repeating that, an object is a thing. These objects have properties and methods. A property is a piece of information. A method is a block of code that executes logic, right? So when you have an object, typically there's, using the dot notation, you will see that there are properties. And so math.py is an example, is a property that belongs to the math object. And math.py holds 3.14 running number, whatever that is. Okay, it is a piece of information, okay, that is stored associated with this math object. Okay, so that is an example of a property. We could do something like get element by ID. That is a method that belongs to the document object. So objects follow a dot notation, meaning object name dot property or object name dot method. Okay, so it just means you give it the name of the object dot name of the property. And you can always tell it's a method when it has parentheses. You could tell it's a property when it doesn't have parentheses. So again, kind of going to math.py, if I say let num equals math.py, now we're storing 3.14 whatever inside of num. Okay, so JavaScript is object-oriented. It's also other paradigms. as we're getting into what is an object is just a generic term for a thing. And I'm giving two examples of objects right here. This one happens to be lowercase, this one happens to be capitalized. The document object and the math object, and we're going to kind of break down what are these different objects in JavaScript. Like what are the built-in, like what's available out of the box in JavaScript as far as the objects are concerned. Well, one classification of objects are called host objects. So as we get into JavaScript objects that are built in include host objects. Host objects means included in the browser environment. So when you're running JavaScript, obviously it runs in a browser. So anytime you're running JavaScript, you're going to be in a browser environment. So these are called, these are the things. These over here are the things that are associated with a browser environment. The first one being the window object. Okay, and so what can you do with the window object? Well, the thing that jumps out to me that you can do with the window object, well, you can open new windows using JavaScript. So if you've ever been on a page before, and we've all been on a page before, and you hover over an ad, or you click on an image, and all of a sudden a pop-up happens, a pop-up window that's not a new tab necessarily, but it's literally a pop-up window over the top of your current window, right? Because there's a difference a little bit, between target equals underscore blank and creating a pop-up. So using the window object. So window object, JavaScript, and we can kind of pull in the MDN. Again, I always like to reference the MDN if you really want to dive deep on the window object. Now keep in mind, let's see if we can get some actual examples. As they're breaking this down, notice that they're breaking it down by the properties of a window object. And if we scroll down far enough, we should get to the methods. Here's the methods. Now built in to the window is an alert. And you might say, well, wait a minute, I didn't have to code a window.alert. So open new windows are pop-ups. That's really common. The window object is called the global object, which means you don't need the object name to call its methods. Okay, it is the one object that you can just call its methods directly without saying window.alert. We can just say alert, right, hi mom. Well, turns out alert belongs to the window object. But because it's known as the global object, you don't have to let's link to it. Right, you don't have to call window dot, but there it is. So we've used alerts. Window.close closes the current window. So just like you can use the window object to open a new window, you could use it to close a window. So let's just do window dot not much to see there, because if you did notice, it opened it and closed it right away. So you can open new windows, you can close windows. You've seen a confirm dialog box. Window.blur and window.focus, you've probably seen it before, where a pop-up happens and it blurs. In other words, it goes behind a window. Like a pop-up is now open, a window is open, but it's not up front. It's behind the other window. So using the window object, we can focus, we can blur, we can alert. Here's window.open, opens a new window. Now if you look at window.open, this is what I'm talking about with the open with a URL. So let's just, instead of doing window.close, windows.open, and you could see it's going to take in a, I'm just going to try http://www.rankin.edu. And right away I get a pop-up blocked, right? You see my little pop-up blocker? Let's just always allow. And there you could see there's your pop-up. And I think I was trying to draw a distinction between like target, like an anchor tag, target of underscore blank. I mean, either way, you're just opening it up in a new window. Notice the defaults, this is a browser behavior. It does go into a new tab by default. But this is totally configurable. Like you can open a window that has window features, and those window features might not be to open up in the same tab. It might be to open up in a bar window that doesn't have a scrolling effect, and it's, you know, it's 200 pixels tall and 500 pixels wide, and it looks more like a traditional pop-up. Okay, so if you kind of look at these Windows features, you can really customize your pop-ups using, so pop-up, yes, pop-up, I don't know, there's all sorts of, you could tell it like the X and Y coordinates where to pop up on the screen, like if you want it in the lower left-hand corner, what have you. These are all features, are all ways to customize your pop-ups, I would say. Okay, getting back to this, and I don't know that I might have skipped this. The window object, it refers to, window object refers to the browser window. Like you're literally talking about the window for your browser. So when you're looking at the window for the browser, again, you can do things like you can customize the height of the browser, the width. You can remove these scroll bars over here. So again, that just makes it, I don't know, like a more traditional pop-up that I'm thinking of, without scroll bars. That is the window object. The window object represents the browser window, primarily useful in pop-ups and closing tabs, closing windows. You know, at one point in time, before browser security was any good, you know, JavaScript would just, you know, pop up 30 pop-ups on users, and, you know, they'd get really annoyed. But now, you know, browser security is such that you really can't do too much harm with these objects. Okay. Again, these are known as host objects, meaning built into the browser, or built into a browser environment. Host objects are the browser environment. Let's see if there's anything else that I skipped on window that You can move window locations, prompt, resize. Window.scroll scrolls the window to a particular place in the document. I've seen a lot of websites that have really neat scrolling animation, right? So when you use anchor tags, Wikipedia is really good at this. So you can use an anchor tag to jump to a location on the page, right? And the way this is done, if you actually look in the lower right-hand corner, you could see that your anchor tag has a pound symbol that says higher order functions returning functions as results. So when you click on this, this heading has an ID that matches that URL. And so that's how to basically jump to locations. Well, using JavaScript, instead of just like a jump like this is doing, you can create a scrolling effect, right? And that's what you're talking about with window.scroll and scroll by, right? You can create scrolling effects to create a more smooth transition from one place in the page to another. So you see a lot of web pages with scrolling effects that can be done with window.scroll. And that's really the main thing on the window object. The next object that is a host object is the document object. Again, this is a host object that represents the HTML document. And so we've used the document object. We say document.getElementById. And this is the most common thing that we've done so far. And now you can kind of break it down. We've got an object and we've got a method. This getElementById is a method that says go into my HTML document and look for an HTML element by its ID. We're going to learn some other methods that belong to the document object. So I'm not going to, break it down like I broke down the window object, because that's actually here in the lecture a little bit more. But the big thing, the window object represents the browser window. The document object represents the HTML document. It represents your HTML file, if you will. And it says allows you to work with the document object model. We're going to break this down in an entire lecture. What is the DOM? Navigator contains information about the browser. How is that useful? Well, it's kind of useful if you want to know your target audience. If you want to gather statistics, like how does anybody know the browser market share for 2022 is 77% Google Chrome? How do they know that? Well, they can collect statistics using JavaScript about what browsers, and there's other ways of doing this, but basically, what browsers are being used on their website. And of course, even if you use this on JavaScript, if it's client-side JavaScript, you ultimately have to save this somewhere that's not client-side, so you have access to the information, what have you. But ultimately, that's where the navigator object, information about the browser. What browser are you using? What version of the browser are you using? And that kind of jazz. I have seen it being used. I've used it. Definitely the big ones here are the window and the document. These are the two major players as far as host objects are concerned. History, not that useful, because it says contains URLs that a user has visited in the browser. And if you think, oh, well, that's kind of cool, like I can see all the websites that my users have been to. No, it only really tells you information about your domain. And so it's not like you could see the full user history of all the websites they've been to unless they've cleared out their history. This is per your domain. So you could see what pages they've been to on your domain. How is that useful? Again, I do think it can be useful if you want to, if you're trying to sell widgets and you're trying to figure out, you're trying to analyze, use analytics for how long are they spending on this page, how long are they spending on that page, before they click buy, that kind of thing. So these are really analytical objects that can pull information, but these are the ones that we code the most. So these are host objects, and then there are other objects. So again, host objects are in the browser environment. Native objects are the objects built into JavaScript that are not associated with the browser environment. And so let's take a look at native objects. Well, an array is an object. Did you need to know that to work with an array? No, we could have done const data equals and say something like 2, 3, and right away we had data dot, and look at this. We've got all these methods and properties. Notice in Visual Studio, methods have this cube and versus the rectangle, properties icons. So we could do data dot length. And so arrays are objects. Now there's even a different syntax for creating an array. And this is a different syntax that now if I want to say data sub 0 equals 1, 2, 3, data sub 1 equals Jim, this works as well. Okay, but suffice to say, arrays are objects, and even though we don't use the keyword new. Why do I show this keyword new? Because anyone who's done object-oriented programming is familiar that the keyword new is your keyword for object. And in JavaScript, and like other languages as well, just because you don't use a keyword doesn't mean it's not an object. So arrays are native objects. There is a data type of object that is, it talks about inheritance a little bit. So, basically you can inherit from object, which means you get some properties and some methods from objects. So all objects are children objects of parent called object, which means all of these have similar, or will have the same properties and methods that come from object, like you inherit these down. There's a date. Turns out that functions are objects as well. Again, we're going to have a whole lecture on functions, so we'll dive into that. Numbers, string, and booleans. Now these are interesting. These three are known as wrapper objects. So they are native objects and wrapper objects. Well, if you remember number, string, and boolean, these were referred to as primitive data types. So in JavaScript, if you go back, we talked about primitive data types being number, string, and Boolean. But then we just learned that these are also objects. So what does it mean to be and specifically a wrapper object? I'll go ahead and pick on a language that some people might be familiar with, which is Java, not C#, Java. In Java, if you would do something like int number equals 1, okay. Number is a primitive data type, and therefore there is no such thing in Java as number dot anything, like to fixed. Remember, to fixed in JavaScript will allow us to kind of round. Because in Java, you don't have you have a strict type, like a strict data type like int. In JavaScript, we have let. And because the JavaScript engine says, hey, I'm storing a number inside of this variable, that gives us access to certain methods and certain properties like toFixed, and says, you know, I could do, right? And that's going to get us to round number to 2 decimal places. So what's kind of happening behind the scenes in JavaScript that's not there in other languages is this typing that says, hey, I see what you have here is a number, so I'm going to store it in a number data type. But this number type, even though it is primitive, we're going to wrap it. We're going to wrap it in this number object so that you have certain methods to work with. So, like, if I can try and simplify all this, it's just to say that even our primitive data types in JavaScript are objects. And in other languages, that's just not the case. In other languages, a primitive data type does not have methods or properties. But in JavaScript, it does, because our primitive data types are wrapper objects. Okay, so a wrapper object is a native object. All native object means is it's built into JavaScript. And anytime we have a variable that's a number or a string or a Boolean, they just kind of automatically become objects, is all that means. And then we've got a utility object, which like the math class, or the math, I should say, object, the math object, which has a lot of utility built in. All that just means is there's a bunch of built-in methods, and like I kind of pi equals math.pi, that's a property, and now I can use pi in my equation, but there's a whole lot of functionality or utility here, properties, and if you get into some higher level math where you're doing logarithms and absolute values, cosines, asines, tangents. It's been a long time since I've taken some of these math classes. There's we can round down using math.floor. There's a lot of built-in functionality, math functionality, using this math utility object. Okay, so I hope I did a good job of describing these kinds of objects, whether it's a host, which means it's associated with the browser environment. Native objects means a JavaScript object kind of built in to the language. And some of these, like the date object, we're going to work with. Some of them just happen automatically. These wrapper objects, when you create variables and that variable holds a number, all of a sudden we have these properties and methods. Because it's a number, we can work with it. They can work with that variable. So here's an example of using a toFixed method. Because it's a number object, this variable right here is a primitive number data type, but it's wrapped in a number object, which allows us to call this toFixed method. And again, that's not the case in a language like Java. Okay, so we covered all of these terms. Let me pause the recording here just for a millisecond. Okay, this slide isn't showing too much, just to confirm. Remember that it belongs to the window object, so we don't have to say window.confirm. We can just call this method confirm. And so if you kind of look here, what are we doing here? Well, basically this confirm prompt is going to return true or false. If they click OK, it's going to return true. If they click cancel, it'll click false. So this variable confirm delete will be equal to true or false. So on the right hand side of this equal sign, this will be true or false. Therefore, you can use it in an if statement that's called a flag. You know, if this is true, run this code, otherwise you don't. So confirms prompts, you know, that's kind of how they work. There are some functions that are called global functions for parsing numbers, and I did include the various global functions to be aware of in this link in the slideshow. So let's reference that. These are objects in global scope, such as window. The global object itself. So here are some other functions. You know, parse float is, what does it mean to be global? It means you don't need its object name. You could just say parse float. So we've used parse float, and now we understand, basically because it's considered global scope, that you don't need its object name to call this function, or to call this method. Just look at parse float. In fact, they don't even talk about it belonging to any particular object. So I'm thinking, because these are global, they're just functions in global scope, I don't know that they are associated with any. These global functions which are called globally rather than on an object, or yes. Okay, good. So they're not associated with an object. Directly return the results to their. Now, okay, so eval is kind of cool. So eval, so if I do alert eval, let's just do 2 plus 2. Kind of can just do some math for us, and it, you know, 2 times 20, right? So eval can take a string and do some math for us, so that's nice. What else is here? Close, close, close. Is not a number. This returns true or false. Okay, very useful function, and it's used quite often. So let's wire something up like a text box. It's really not necessary to do this, but let's go ahead and bring in our starter template and our script tag. And a form. It's really interesting. They don't have input type of text as a what have you input. Oh, there's the default input type of text. ID is text number. Let's do div class call hyphen 2 times 6. And let's just put this one in the first call. Let's put a button in our next call. Button type of button. Okay, really, it's really a lot of work for not much result. Okay, do work. We're going to wire up an event handler. And console.log. Okay, I need to give this an ID of do work. Okay. And let's do a let data. I think I called it text number. Text number dot value. If is not a number, all this to show if is not a number, and this is going to return true or false. Data. Alert, please enter a number, or, you know, little error message here. maybe we make enter a number go red, or here we'll do we'll do a little star, right? Div, it's an ID error with a little star, must enter a number. And we're going to do a little style to say let's have a class of and a class of hide. This will be display none. And this will be display block. Actually, by default, it's display block. So let's just have a class of hide. So this div will have a class of hide. So by default, we should not see the error message. Okay. And we're going to remove a class. And we haven't really done anything along this line. This is a whole lecture in itself, how to dynamically add classes and things like that. But here, this is if this is not a number. This is the error. Display the error. And the way to display the error is by removing the class of hide, which will make this be, visible by default. Make this class hide go away. Therefore, it'll be the default display, which is display block. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to target that div, the ID of error. Hey, Theo. What's up?
That PC won't turn on.
His won't turn on. Yeah. Can you extract the hard drive?
Yeah. So I have it out, but
okay.
It'll be fine if I just put it in there. It won't
Won't
lock or
conflict.
anything.
It'd be all right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to target my error. This is my div, and I'm going to do dot class list dot remove. Now I have to remove the class of hide. So you could see we're going to target the div, get the class list. This is a property. Then call the remove element of hide, and let's see if it's not a number, and else let's just say double the number. Okay, so here, and this will be our output tag. It's an ID of result. Document dot get element by ID result dot enter HTML equals we got data, something like that. Otherwise, it is a number. Okay, so it says do work. If we enter a number A, must enter a number. So that basically made that div visible. That worked. Now what I need to do is here, not only do I need to do the work, but I also need to add the class list back on. So it's a document.getElementById error .ClassList.add hide. So this worked, right? All that to show you isNaN. isNaN is looking at our variable, which comes out of the text box, and displays an error in the case of, oh, by the way, we could, hide could also do color red, right? Something. Oh, doesn't matter. We make, we need this do work. There we go. Oh, on the wrong selector, on error. Okay, so enter a number. If I give them a letter, must enter a number. If I give them a number 2, we get the output of 4. And the number 3, give them the output of 6. Put in some letters, must enter a number. We should probably hide that result in the error condition. So let's also do that. Take this equal to empty string. There's my fun little demo on data validation before we ever get to data validation. All just to demonstrate isNaN. Very useful function that's global in nature, that can look at some data and to tell you is it a number or not. You could use that inside of an if statement and do something like data validation with it. Okay, so we kind of left off, talking about these global functions built in. We've used parseInt and parseFloat. The main thing those are is to take a string, like out of a text box, for example, a value out of a text box, and get it into a number. So that typically we can do math, but typically that math is addition, because JavaScript is smart enough to do multiplication on strings. Like if you do string 3 times string 3, it's going to give you 9. But if you do addition on 3 plus 3, it's going to concatenate those strings and give you 33 instead of 6. So a lot of times you use parseInt and parseFloat to do addition. There are some other methods that are pretty common to select in JavaScript. Now, to select in JavaScript, right now we're just using getElementById. And if you remember CSS, there's a lot of ways to select your HTML in CSS. Turns out in JavaScript, we can leverage CSS selectors in JavaScript. And I'll do a demonstration here. Where, like, let's just say I have the same exact kind of thing over here. And this will be number 2, error 2, class of hide. So we've got 2 divs with the same class on it. And so, like, for my example, let's just say there's even another one of these things. Just making up some silly example. Where now we've got 3 divs with the class of hide on it. And so here, if data is not a number, like I want to remove all of the hides. Well, instead of selecting a single div like this, I'm going to select multiple divs with document.get elements. And there's all sorts of selectors. Get elements by class name, which I could do. But a popular selector is query selector all. Now it doesn't start with get, that's why it wasn't popping up for me. Query selector and query selector all, this allows us to use a CSS query selector, a CSS selector. So like if I were to say, in the difference between selector and selector all, if I say query selector, it's going to select the first element kind of top to bottom that it finds. Query selector all will use any CSS selector. Like if I want to select any class, any element with the class of hide. Well, notice .hide, that's how we select things in CSS. So I'll store this in a variable called divs. Turns out that query selector all can select multiple elements. Well, how are we going to store multiple elements? We're going to store it in an array. So this method right here actually returns an array of elements, and so divs will be an array. Because if it was a single element, it would not be an array, but it's multiple elements. So divs is an array. So let's do a for each loop on divs. So we'll do divs.forEach, and so we're looping through our array. Each time the div will be called element, and here we'll just do element dot class list remove hide. So this is going to loop through each div and remove the class of hide. All this goes back to this query selector. This selects all of the elements with the class of hide. This will loop through each div. The first div will be called element. We could call it, we could call it div. Whatever we want to call it. But kind of a, this element, each element, and remove hide. So the idea here is we're reading the data out of the first text box, and if it is not a number, we're going to show all of the errors. Let's see if it works, or if I did something that broke it. Now the class list of hide, these are the errors, they're not there. There you go, the errors are there. So my loop worked. And my selector worked. That's the tricky part behind these selectors, is you have to understand, does the method return a single element or multiple elements? If it returns multiple elements, it's going to return an array of elements. And anytime you're working with an array, you need to probably loop through the array and do something on all of them. So again here, query selector returns the first element. Query selector all returns all the elements that match the selector. It has to take a valid CSS selector. So you could do all these complex CSS3 selectors that we did. Child selectors, descendant, grandparents, parents, blah, blah, blah. General sibling. Remember the 30 CSS selectors that you must memorize? Remember that article you looked at and you learned all these various CSS selectors? Well, you can select your HTML using all of that. Right, so here's selecting an ID of rate. Here's selecting all of your anchor tags and returns an array of links. Here's selecting by class, exactly what I did. Descendant selectors in CSS. It's great about this is you're leveraging your knowledge of CSS and applying it with a function in JavaScript called query selector or query selector all. Look, this is selecting all H2s inside of facts and all the paragraphs inside of divs. Now, kind of going back to these objects that are built in, you know, these native objects. One that they don't have on here is a text box object. And there's text box object JavaScript. And let's go to MDN. Interesting. MDN. It's interesting that it's not coming up, but there is a text box object, unless I'm going crazy. Let's go back to my last search. Here's a couple of text boxes. So these are methods and properties of text boxes. So using JavaScript, we can focus a text box. So here, let's just, you know, in this case, we've got text number 3. So we can write a little document.getElementById, text number 3 dot focus. And so, you know, notice where the focus is. And you could do this, obviously I'm doing it when the page loads, but you could do it, you know, however you want. Like, for example, common use of this is if you're doing validation and you got an error on a particular text box, you can focus that text box. So the user, you know, they click the button and it doesn't work. So do they want to search for their error, or no, you focus their error. You let them know where it is. Select. Now, select versus focus. If there were text in there, let's put a text value in there. You can see it selects that text value so that if the user starts typing, right? So there's a slight difference between focus and text, or between select and focus. So here, this is focused, the cursor is at the beginning. Select, it's there. If you start typing, it replaces it. Kind of what you would expect there. If you've ever seen a disabled text box, so I could say .disabled. A lot of times I do this with buttons, right? This is, you can disable a control. It can be kind of maddening sometimes, which does not let the user, you know, interact with it. So, of course, you could do this with HTML as well, but that's not dynamic, right? So the idea is that we're doing this on button click or on validation or what have you. And then we've demonstrated the number object to fixed on more than one occasion, but let's just do that. Let number equals, and then we'll say text number 3 dot value equals number to fixed 2. And launch. You can see it rounds it. we've done some of this concept of chaining, which is, you know, chaining functions and properties together. So here is an example of 2 lines of code where we use a query selector to select an ID of first name, and then read the value out of it. However, we just do it all in one line. We say, okay, let's select the first name, which query selector is a method, and then we chain the property, the .value property. So like you've been doing this chaining whether you knew it was called chaining or not. You are selecting something using a method, and then once that selection is done, reading a property off of that selection. We've done parse floats. This is chaining with parse floats. So here we select, so this is like the first part, we select something and then we focus it. All right. So there's built-in objects, and we're almost done here. A lot of the built-in objects kind of happen behind the scenes, like these wrapper objects. But there's also objects that are that you have to be more explicit in how you code them. For example, a date object. A date object is not a wrapper object, and it's going to store a date. And so this is a native object built into JavaScript that is, you know, there to work with dates, and there's a bunch of methods. So the way that we create a date object is a little bit more traditional. Let's just kind of bring this back here. So we'll do const date, or today equals new date. And so this is kind of a syntax that if you've ever done object-oriented programming, you're used to this keyword new. Now we can say today dot and get date and throw that in alert or console.log and kind of take a look at what happens. Pretty much what you might expect, maybe not. Did I save that? Save, console.log. Let's load it up. And interesting, oh, it was there, I just overlooked it, because all I'm getting back is 30. Now that's interesting. Well, today is the 30th, so you might expect a little bit more information, and I wouldn't blame you. So therefore, let's look at the different. Get date is the reason why we just got the number 30. For example, if you want a little more information, of course, you can go through here and let's get of course full year, get months, get seconds, get time. There we go, to date string. That's going to be to date string. And that gives you something like Thursday, June 30th, 2022. As you can see, there's a lot of methods, and you can break down these dates in all sorts of ways, all different sorts of formats. The first thing to do, of course, is to start with a date object, and then you can call all these various methods that give you different pieces of a date. And so that's pretty straightforward in how that works. And then a bunch of methods of strings. Remember, these string objects are these wrapper objects. So you get all sorts of methods and properties to work with strings. One of the first things you could do is you can break down a string as a char array. And so that's one thing worth mentioning. So if I were to say let name equals Evan, and I do console.log name sub 0, and you've probably seen this if you've gone through, that's a capital E. So a string is a char array. If I do name sub 1, of course I get back the letter V. So that's one way to work with a string. If I say name, but if I work with the properties and methods, which are here in the to uppercase, of course, is one that will take it and make it caps. Right, so all Evan. So let's do this. Let's do an example. Let's have a search feature, right? So the search feature, enter a name to search for. This will be text name. Text name. I'm not really worried about the errors right now. So let's have a const names list equals Billy, Bob, and Sam. Let's get our button. I think it's called button do work. Oh, BTN do work, button do work. I'm going to link to script instead of index, because I changed a setting that helps me with these little red squigglies. Okay, so let search name equals document get element by ID text. We called it text name dot value dot to lowercase. So we're going to take the value out of the text box because we know it's a string. We're going to take it to lowercase. So no matter what the user types, we're going to convert it to lowercase. And let's go ahead and loop through our names list. So I'll do a for each loop. And I'll say names list. For each name, I'll say if name dot to lowercase. Now sometimes there's an equals and there is no equals here. Triple equals search name. We'll do an alert or document get element by ID result dot enter HTML equals name was found. Okay, so to walk through this in an array of names, we read out of a text box, we lowercase what the user types, We also, when we're looping through our names list array, we take each name and we lowercase each name. So capital Billy goes to lowercase Billy. So it's lowercase Billy against whatever the user is searching for. And if it's found, it'll say Billy was found. So there is no, right now, there is nothing for being displayed in the otherwise. So if I refresh and I just say Evan, there's nothing there to say the name was not found. But if I say Sam in all caps, it says Sam was found. Again, refresh. We need something for John. We need to say John not found. So to kind of put in that little clause of not found, I'll say bool found is false. Or excuse me, let found is false. If it's found, we'll say found is changed to true. Right? So once we're done looping through our names list, here at the end we'll say if it's still not found, we'll do this. Inner HTML is, and this will be search name. Search name was not found. So if I say Sam was found, Thomas was not found. Now it did take it to lowercase because when I did that when I read it out right here, I took it to lowercase. All right, so that's a little search feature, and that kind of demonstrates some of the power of converting lower cases. That way it does a case insensitive search. And you could do all sorts of substrings which allow you to extract bits of a string. Like if you just wanted to get the first name or the last name, you could substring, take a big string and extract a smaller string out of it. Right, so we did talk about text box object, document object, global objects, date objects, string objects. All right, and that's where we're going to stop this lecture this morning for the first half.